He could command thousands of people with a single phone call. But at 38,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Ethan Kong couldn't do the one thing that mattered most. His son would not stop crying. The private cabin of the Boeing 777 glowed with soft amber lighting, polished wood accents reflecting against the windows as darkness stretched endlessly outside. Most passengers on the overnight flight from Seoul to New York had long since fallen asleep, wrapped in blankets and lulled by the steady hum of the engines. But sleep had become impossible for everyone seated near row 2. 11-month-old Noah Kong had been crying for nearly 7 hours. Not fussing, not whining, crying. The kind of desperate, heartbreaking cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than discomfort. The kind that made strangers glance at one another with concern. The kind that slowly wore down every nerve in the room. Ethan sat rigidly in his leather seat, his white dress shirt rolled at the sleeves, dark circles beneath eyes that hadn't truly rested in months. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals. He had built an empire from almost nothing. He had spent his entire life solving problems faster than everyone around him. Yet now he stared helplessly at his son as the child twisted in the nanny's arms, face red with tears. "Try the bottle again," Ethan said quietly. The nanny nodded and offered the warmed formula once more. Noah turned away instantly and cried even harder. Across the aisle, a pediatric specialist Ethan had hired for the trip checked the baby's temperature for the 3rd time. Normal. Oxygen levels. Normal. Heart rate. Elevated from distress, but otherwise normal. Everything was normal except for the fact that the child had not stopped crying for most of the flight. Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw and looked toward the dark cabin window. The reflection staring back at him looked nothing like the man people feared. It looked exhausted, defeated. A flight attendant approached carefully. Her professional smile was beginning to crack under the pressure. "Mr. Kong, several passengers are asking if there's anything they can do." Ethan glanced toward the rows. Behind him, even from here, he could see irritated faces peeking over seats. Some passengers looked frustrated. Others looked sympathetic. Most simply looked tired. "Thank them," he replied. "But no." The attendant nodded and stepped away. Noah's cries echoed through the cabin once more. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. 3 months ago, Noah's mother had still been alive. 3 months ago, there had always been someone who could calm him. Someone who knew exactly which song to sing, exactly how to hold him, exactly what every tiny expression meant. Now there was only Ethan. And despite all his power, all his money, all his influence, he felt completely lost. Another cry tore through the silence. Louder this time. Sharper. Even the nanny looked close to tears. Then, somewhere near the back of the plane, a seatbelt clicked open. Most passengers ignored the sound. Ethan did not. Years of instinct made him notice everything. Slowly, his eyes lifted toward the rear of the aircraft. A woman stood from an economy-class seat. She looked to be in her early 50s. Her coat was worn. Her shoes had seen better years. Gray curls framed a tired face marked by hardship and long days of work. Nobody paid attention to her. Nobody except Ethan. Because unlike everyone else on the plane, the woman wasn't looking annoyed. She wasn't looking exhausted. She wasn't even looking surprised. She was staring at Noah with an expression that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Recognition. As if she knew something that nobody else did. Ruth Carter remained standing beside her seat, while the aircraft hummed steadily through the darkness. Around her, most passengers barely noticed. Those who did exchanged puzzled glances before returning to their phones, books, or exhausted attempts at sleep. But Ruth kept her eyes fixed on the child. Noah's cries rose and fell in uneven waves, and with each passing minute the concern on her face deepened. She had heard cries like that before. Not once or twice, but hundreds of times. The difference was subtle. Most people could not hear it. Parents sometimes could. Caregivers sometimes could. Ruth certainly could. At the front of the cabin, the nanny bounced Noah gently against her shoulder. The pediatric specialist whispered something to Ethan, who responded with a frustrated shake of his head. Another bottle was prepared. Another toy was offered. Another attempt failed. The baby's tiny hands clenched and unclenched as tears streamed down his cheeks. He looked exhausted, yet somehow unable to rest. Ruth slowly stepped into the aisle. A nearby passenger frowned. "Ma'am, you should probably stay seated." Ruth offered a polite smile, but did not sit back down. Her attention never left the child. There was something familiar about the way he reacted to every sound around him. The clink of a glass, the rustling of a blanket. Even the overhead announcement that had played 20 minutes earlier seemed to have made him cry harder. A flight attendant noticed her approaching and quickly stepped forward. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Ruth hesitated. She knew how she looked. Her coat had been repaired more than once. The carry-on bag at her feet was older than some of the passengers on board. Nothing about her appearance suggested expertise. Nothing suggested that she belonged anywhere near the private section of the aircraft. Still, she gathered her courage. "I think something is bothering that baby." The flight attendant glanced toward Noah and gave a tired smile. "Yes, everyone can see that." "No," Ruth replied softly. I think I know what kind of thing is bothering him." Before the attendant could answer, another cry echoed through the cabin. Several passengers sighed loudly. One man pulled headphones tighter over his ears. A woman across the aisle shook her head with visible irritation. Frightened children overwhelmed by the world around them. Slowly she looked back toward the front of the aircraft. Ethan was standing now. One hand rested on the seat beside him as he stared helplessly at his son. The powerful businessman looked completely different from the image that appeared in magazines and business journals. There was no confidence left in his posture. Only worry. Only fear. Ruth studied the child for another few seconds. Then her gaze shifted toward Ethan. The answer she had suspected since leaving her seat settled heavily in her chest. Noah was not crying because he was hungry. He was not crying because he was sick. And he was not crying because he was tired. Ruth knew that with startling certainty. The real reason was something nobody on that plane seemed to have considered. Taking a slow breath, she stepped forward again. This time, she did not stop. Ruth walked past 3 rows before the flight attendant stepped into her path again. This time the smile was gone, replaced by polite concern. "Ma'am, I really need you to return to your seat." Ruth stopped. The soft cabin lights reflected in her dark eyes as she glanced toward Noah once more. The child had not slowed down. If anything, his distress seemed worse. His small body trembled with exhaustion, yet he continued fighting against sleep as though something around him would not let him rest. Ruth lowered her voice. "I am not trying to cause trouble. I understand." "Then please tell his father I only need 30 seconds. The flight attendant hesitated. Before she could answer, Ethan's voice carried across the cabin. "What is it?" Both women turned. Ethan remained standing beside his seat, one hand resting on the armrest while the nanny struggled to comfort Noah. The flight attendant quickly explained. "This passenger believes she may know what is upsetting your son." Ethan looked at Ruth for the first time. The distance between them was only a few yards, but they came from completely different worlds. He noticed the worn coat, the inexpensive shoes, the tired face. Ruth noticed the expensive watch, the tailored clothing, and the exhaustion hidden beneath his composed expression. For a moment neither spoke. Then Noah let out another piercing cry. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He looked as though he had not slept in days. "You think you know what is wrong?" he finally asked. Ruth nodded carefully. "I think I know what it might be." The pediatric specialist immediately stepped forward. "With respect, sir, we have already ruled out every obvious medical concern." Ruth looked at him kindly. "I am sure you have. Then what exactly are you suggesting?" Ruth folded her hands together. "Before I answer that, I need to ask something." Ethan's expression tightened. "Go ahead." Was his mother usually the one who calmed him? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. The nanny looked down. The doctor fell silent. Even the flight attendant seemed caught off guard. Ethan stared at Ruth. "Why would you ask that?" His voice was not angry. It was wary. Ruth glanced toward Noah. "Because he sounds like a child looking for something he cannot find." Ethan said nothing. The silence stretched for several seconds. Finally he answered. "His mother passed away 3 months ago." The words came out flat, rehearsed, as though he had repeated them too many times already. Ruth's heart sank. She had suspected as much. "I am sorry," she said softly. Ethan gave a small nod, but did not respond. Ruth continued. "Children remember more than adults think they do. Sometimes they remember sounds, rhythms, voices, the way someone held them, the way someone sang to them." Noah cried again. Ruth watched him carefully. The timing, the reactions, the tension in his tiny shoulders. Everything pointed her toward the same conclusion. "He is not fighting sleep," she said quietly. "He is fighting everything around him." The pediatric specialist frowned. "What does that mean?" Ruth took a slow breath. I think this cabin is overwhelming him. Several people exchanged confused looks. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. For the first time all night, however, Noah suddenly paused between cries. Only for a second, barely noticeable, but Ruth saw it. And the moment she did, a memory from many years ago flashed through her mind. A little boy sitting alone beside a therapy room window. The same expression, the same fear, the same desperate search for one familiar sound. Ruth could feel the skepticism spreading through the cabin. The pediatric specialist folded his arms. The flight attendant looked uncertain. Even a few nearby passengers exchanged doubtful glances. To them, she was simply an older woman from economy class offering theories while trained professionals stood nearby. Under different circumstances, Ruth might have felt embarrassed. Tonight she did not. Her attention remained on Noah. The child had entered a cycle she recognized all too well. Exhaustion fed distress. Distress fed exhaustion. Each cry became harder for his small body to sustain, yet he could not stop. Ethan studied her carefully. He had spent years learning how to read people. Most approached him wanting something. Money, influence, opportunity. Ruth Carter wanted none of those things. What unsettled him was that she seemed genuinely concerned about his son. What exactly are you suggesting? Ethan finally asked. Ruth chose her words carefully. I think he is overwhelmed by the environment. The lights, the voices, the unfamiliar sounds, the changes in routine. And I think he is searching for something that used to help him feel safe. Ethan glanced toward Noah. The baby had buried his face against the nanny's shoulder again. Tiny fingers gripped the fabric of her blouse as another cry escaped him. We have tried everything, the nanny whispered. Her eyes looked glassy from fatigue. His favorite toys, his favorite blanket, the recordings on my phone. Ruth immediately focused on that last detail. Recordings? The nanny nodded. His mother's voice. The words seemed to freeze the air around them. Ethan looked away toward the dark cabin window. For a brief moment, his reflection blurred. Ruth understood then. The loss was still fresh. Every mention of Noah's mother carried weight. And do the recordings help? Ruth asked gently. The nanny hesitated. Sometimes. Ruth nodded slowly. Sometimes. Not always. That detail mattered. A memory surfaced from years earlier. A frightened child refusing every comfort except one specific lullaby sung a specific way. Not because of the song itself, because of the feeling attached to it. The memory tightened something in Ruth's chest. She took a small step forward. May I ask another question? Ethan looked back at her. Go ahead. Did his mother sing to him often? The answer came immediately. Every night. Ruth swallowed. Her suspicion grew stronger. Noah suddenly cried out again. Several sleeping passengers stirred. One man sighed loudly from a nearby row. The tension throughout the aircraft had become impossible to ignore. Yet amid all the noise, Ruth noticed something remarkable. Each time Noah paused between cries, his eyes drifted toward the same side of the cabin, toward the window, toward the darkness beyond it, as though he were listening for something, waiting for something. Ruth felt a chill run through her. She had seen this before. Not the child, not the situation, but the longing. The search for a familiar presence after a devastating loss. Slowly she turned back toward Ethan. I do not think he needs medicine right now, she said softly. I think he needs a memory. For the first time all night, Ethan's expression changed. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to hope. Small and fragile, but unmistakably there. And for reasons he could not explain, he found himself asking a question he never expected to ask a stranger. If you were in my place, he said quietly, what would you do next? The question hung in the air between them. Ruth had not expected it. A few minutes earlier, she had been just another passenger in economy class, invisible among hundreds of strangers crossing an ocean in the middle of the night. Now one of the most powerful men on the aircraft was looking at her as though her answer mattered. Ruth glanced at Noah. The child was still crying, but there was something different now. The pauses between the cries had grown slightly longer. Tiny moments when he seemed to listen for something before panic returned. Ruth drew a slow breath. I would stop trying to make him comfortable, she said softly. Confusion crossed several faces around her. Even Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Ruth stepped closer, careful not to invade anyone's space. Everyone here is trying to fix the problem. The bottles, the toys, the medicine, the distractions. But what if he is not looking for comfort? Noah let out another cry. Ruth watched him carefully. What if he is looking for someone? The nanny's eyes filled with emotion. She looked down immediately. Ethan remained silent. Deep down, he had wondered the same thing more times than he wanted to admit. Since his wife's passing, there had been nights when Noah woke suddenly and refused every comfort available. Nights when he wandered the nursery carrying his son for hours, unable to soothe him. Nights when he stood beside the crib feeling like a stranger in his own child's world. Ruth noticed the pain flash briefly across his face. Did his mother have a favorite song? She asked. Ethan blinked. The question caught him off guard. A song, a lullaby, something she sang often. Ethan looked away. The answer came almost immediately. Every night. His voice had become quieter. The same one. Ruth nodded. Her heart sank and lifted at the same time. Do you remember it? Ethan hesitated. The cabin seemed to grow still around him. He remembered every word, every note. Every evening, he had stood outside Noah's room listening to his wife sing while rocking their son to sleep. The memory felt both precious and painful. Yes, he admitted. Ruth smiled gently. Then that is where I would start. The pediatric specialist shifted uncomfortably. With respect, there is no evidence that a song can resolve this level of distress. Ruth looked at him kindly. Maybe not. Then she turned back toward Noah. But sometimes the heart remembers things that science cannot measure. Ethan stared at his son. The tiny boy's face was wet with tears. His small chest rose and fell rapidly. For the first time all night, however, Ethan felt something besides helplessness. He felt possibility. It was fragile, uncertain, yet it was there. Slowly he reached into the pocket of his jacket and removed his phone. His thumb hovered above the screen. The recording was still there. He had never deleted it. Never could. A simple audio file. 3 minutes and 12 seconds long. His wife's voice, singing softly in the nursery. Ethan swallowed hard as the screen illuminated his face. Around them, the cabin grew unexpectedly quiet, almost as if everyone sensed that something important was about to happen. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at the screen. His thumb rested above the play button while memories he had spent months trying to manage came rushing back all at once. He remembered quiet evenings in the nursery, warm lamplight spilling across the walls, Noah drifting to sleep against his mother's shoulder. The soft melody she sang almost without thinking. At the time it had seemed ordinary. Now it felt priceless. Around him the aircraft remained unusually quiet. Even the passengers who had complained earlier seemed curious. Noah's cries continued to echo through the cabin, but everyone was watching the same thing now. Ethan took a slow breath and pressed play. At first, only a faint crackle came through the speaker. Then a woman's voice emerged. Gentle, warm, familiar. The recording was not perfect. There was background noise. The distant creak of a rocking chair. A tiny baby cooing somewhere in the background. But none of that mattered. The moment the melody began, something changed. Noah froze. It lasted less than a second. So brief that most people would have missed it. Ruth did not. Ethan did not. The nanny certainly did not. The little boy's crying stopped in the middle of a breath. His eyes widened. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath with him. The song continued. Noah turned his head toward the phone. Tears still clung to his cheeks, but confusion had replaced panic. He listened, really listened. The familiar voice filled the space around him. Not loud, not dramatic, just a mother singing to her child. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had not heard the recording in weeks. It hurt too much. Yet now, hearing it again through his son's ears, he noticed details he had forgotten. The tenderness in her voice. The way she laughed softly between verses. The affection hidden inside every word. Noah let out one final whimper. Then silence. Complete silence. The nanny's mouth fell open. The pediatric specialist lowered his arms. A passenger, several rows away, slowly removed his headphones. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They were afraid to break whatever miracle they were witnessing. Noah blinked once, twice. Then he stretched a tiny hand toward the phone. Ethan felt emotion surge through him so suddenly that he had to look away. 7 hours. 7 endless hours of crying, worry, frustration, and fear. Yet all his son had needed was the sound he associated with safety. The sound he thought he had lost forever. Ruth watched quietly from the aisle. There was no triumph in her expression. No sense of proving herself right. Only relief. The kind that comes when a hurting child finally finds peace. The song continued playing. Noah's breathing slowed. His tiny fingers relaxed. His eyelids grew heavy. Within minutes, The child who had kept an entire airplane awake was asleep. Deeply asleep. The nanny carefully adjusted the blanket around him. Tears slipped down her face. Ethan remained motionless. His eyes never left his son. Then, slowly, he turned toward Ruth. The look he gave her was completely different from the one he had given earlier. Gone was the cautious skepticism. Gone was the distance. In its place was something far more powerful. Gratitude. And as Ruth met his gaze across the quiet cabin, she realized this night was far from over. For the first time that night, people returned to their seats without frustration. Conversations resumed in whispers. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with visible relief. Yet Ethan Kong remained exactly where he was. Noah slept peacefully in the nanny's arms, his tiny face finally relaxed beneath the soft glow of the overhead lights. The transformation felt almost impossible. A few minutes earlier, the entire aircraft had revolved around a child's distress. Now only the steady hum of the engines filled the air. Ethan looked at Ruth for a long moment before speaking. "How did you know?" His voice was quiet enough that only those nearby could hear. Ruth glanced at the sleeping child and smiled softly. "Because I have seen it before." Ethan motioned toward an empty seat across from him. "Please, sit down." Ruth hesitated. She was not accustomed to invitations from men like Ethan Kong. Still, she accepted and settled carefully into the seat. The nanny remained nearby, gently rocking Noah while the recording continued at low volume. Ethan folded his hands together. "You recognized something everyone else missed." Ruth looked out the window for a moment. Beyond the glass stretched endless darkness broken only by distant stars. "Many years ago, I worked in a pediatric support center in Atlanta," she said. "Children came to us from every kind of situation. Some were sick. Some had developmental challenges. Some were grieving losses they were too young to explain." Ethan listened without interruption. One little boy stopped speaking for almost 2 months after losing his grandmother. Doctors ran tests. Therapists tried exercises. Nothing worked. Then one afternoon a volunteer started humming a church song his grandmother used to sing. Ruth smiled at the memory. The boy spoke within minutes. Ethan looked down at the floor. "You are saying Noah misses her." "I think Noah remembers her." Ruth's answer came gently. "There is a difference." Those words settled heavily between them. Ethan had spent months focusing on schedules, doctors, specialists, and solutions. He had searched for ways to help his son move forward. Yet he had rarely stopped to consider what Noah might still be carrying inside. A memory, a voice, a feeling of safety. Ruth reached into her handbag and removed an old photograph. The edges were worn from years of handling. She studied it for a moment before showing it to Ethan. It pictured a much younger Ruth standing beside a group of children outside a community center. Ethan glanced at it politely. Then his expression changed. One of the women in the background looked familiar. He leaned closer. "Wait." Ruth nodded. "I thought you might recognize her." Ethan stared at the image. His pulse quickened. The woman smiling beside the playground fence was unmistakable. Younger, certainly, but unmistakable. It was his wife. For several seconds he could not speak. "How do you have this?" he finally whispered. Ruth looked down at the photograph with affection. "Because before she became your wife, she volunteered at our center every summer." Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. The coincidence seemed impossible. Yet something in Ruth's eyes told him it was true. And suddenly he realized that the stranger who had helped save his son that night might not have been a stranger at all. Ethan stared at the photograph as though it had become a doorway into a life he thought he understood. The cabin around him faded into the background. The engines hummed steadily. Passengers slept. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles. Yet all he could see was the smiling woman in the picture. His wife, years younger, standing beside Ruth and a group of children he had never known existed. "She never told me about this," he said softly. Ruth nodded. "Most people never heard about it. She did not volunteer for attention. She came because she cared." Ethan traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. The image unlocked memories he had not allowed himself to visit in months. He remembered the way she would stop conversations to listen when someone was hurting. The way she remembered names, birthdays, small details everyone else overlooked. She had always carried kindness as naturally as breathing. Ruth smiled at the memory. Every summer she showed up with books, snacks, toys, and more patience than anyone I have ever met. The children adored her. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Across the aisle, Noah remained asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully beneath the blanket. The sight alone felt miraculous. Ruth continued. One afternoon, a little girl refused to speak to anyone. Not her teachers. Not her family. Not us. Your wife sat beside her for almost 3 hours without saying much at all. Just listening. By the end of the day, that little girl would not let go of her hand. Ethan lowered his gaze. That sounded exactly like her. Not extraordinary because she sought recognition. Extraordinary because she never did. For months after her passing, Ethan had focused on surviving, running his businesses, managing responsibilities, protecting Noah. Grief became something he pushed aside because there was always another decision waiting, another problem, demanding attention, another obligation pulling him forward. Yet sitting across from Ruth, hearing stories from a chapter of his wife's life he had never known, the wall he had built around his emotions began to crack. She used to sing everywhere, Ruth said with a soft laugh. Not because she thought she was talented, because she believed songs made people feel less alone. Ethan closed his eyes. He could hear her voice again, not from the recording this time, from memory, clearer than it had been in months. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ruth reached into her handbag once more and removed a folded piece of paper. The edges were faded with age. Carefully, she handed it to him. Ethan unfolded it. His breath caught instantly. The page contained handwritten lyrics. Familiar lyrics. The lullaby. At the bottom was a short note written in his wife's unmistakable handwriting. To the children who need comfort most. Music helps us remember that we are loved. Ethan stared at the words as emotion surged through him. Across the cabin, Noah shifted peacefully in his sleep. And for the first time since losing the woman he loved, Ethan did not feel as though she was slipping further away. Through a stranger's kindness, through an old photograph, through a simple song, she suddenly felt closer than she had in a very long time. The wheels touched the runway just after dawn. Outside the windows, New York was waking beneath a sky painted in soft shades of gold and blue. Inside the cabin, most passengers were still asleep, unaware that the longest flight of Ethan Kang's life had ended very differently than it began. Noah remained asleep as well, curled peacefully beneath his blanket, one tiny hand resting against his chest. The child had not cried again. Not once. Ethan stood beside his seat and watched his son for several moments before looking toward Ruth. She was gathering her belongings quietly, preparing to disappear back into the crowd the same way she had appeared. No attention, no recognition, no expectation of reward. Just a woman ready to continue her journey. Ethan walked toward her. The nanny and flight attendants exchanged glances, but said nothing. When he reached her row, Ruth looked up and offered a polite smile. "Looks like he made it through the night," she said. Ethan nodded. "Because of you." Ruth shook her head gently. "Because of his mother." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and removed a business card. It was simple, elegant, and carried enough influence to open almost any door in the city. He extended it toward her. "Please take this." Ruth glanced at the card but did not reach for it. "I appreciate the gesture." "This is not a gesture." Ethan's voice remained calm. "You helped my son when nobody else could. If you ever need anything, a place to stay, medical care, help with work, anything at all, call me." Ruth studied him carefully. She could see that he meant every word. Yet after a moment she smiled and pushed the card gently back toward him. "Then let me ask for one thing." Ethan looked surprised. "Anything." Ruth glanced toward the sleeping child at the front of the cabin. "When he wakes up, tell him about her." Ethan followed her gaze. "What do you mean?" "Tell him the stories. The small ones. The ordinary ones. The way she laughed. The way she sang. The way she cared for people. Do not let him grow up knowing only that he lost his mother. Let him know who she was." Ethan felt those words settle deep inside him. More deeply than any business lesson. More deeply than any advice he had received from experts or counselors. Ruth was right. He had spent months trying to protect Noah from pain. In the process, he had almost forgotten to give him the gift of memory. The line of passengers slowly began moving toward the exit. Ruth picked up her worn handbag and stepped into the aisle. Before she left, she paused beside Ethan one final time. She would be proud of him, she said softly. Then she smiled. And she would want you to be proud of yourself too. Ethan watched her walk away until she disappeared into the crowd. No security detail escorted her. No cameras followed her. Within seconds, she became just another traveler in a busy airport. Yet somehow she had changed more than an entire team of specialists ever could. A few minutes later, Noah stirred awake in his father's arms. His eyes blinked open slowly. Then he smiled. A small smile. Simple and innocent. Ethan felt his own smile appear in return. Beyond the terminal windows, the morning sun climbed higher over the city. And as he held his son close, Ethan finally understood something money, power, and influence could never buy. Sometimes the people who leave the greatest mark on our lives are the ones the world barely notices. And on a flight across the Pacific Ocean, a tired woman with a kind heart reminded a grieving father what love looks like when it refuses to disappear.